Hi everybody, this is Brazy and welcome to Greed Between the Lines. Just a little news update for all you critical thinkers out there. We're going to have a look at some news that affects Australians and of course Australians around the world. Got a few stories I think you might be interested in. First of all, we've got a bit of a win for the anti-vaccine enthusiasts. It's a cracker of a story. We're going to follow that one up with the Aussie banks who have been busted rigging interest rates in Singapore, but of course no one's gone to jail, but it is an interesting one. And thirdly, ASIC. Our good friends ASIC are guilty of knocking down 250,000 websites just while they're trying to get, of course, one website. That's a good one. And finally, Australia, believe it or not, has its own Gitmo or Guantanamo Bay or a legal prison over in Afghanistan, and of course has been caught torturing prisoners and holding them for a long time without any sort of charge. So it should be interesting, but first of all, let's start it all off with this vaccine, shall we? That's right. In Japan, they've issued a health warning saying whatever you do, don't take the Gardasil vaccine or the cervix vaccine. That, of course, was developed by our own Australian of the Year, Ian Fraser, the one that we've now decided to pump into 13 and 14-year-old Australian boys as well as girls. And that's had a huge backlash due to the side effects and, of course, adverse effects that it's had on over 15,000 American females. And the Japanese have now given it an official health warning. So have a look at this article. I think it's fair to say that Diane Harper has come out to try and do the right thing. She's coming out, she's not trying to take revenge against pharmaceutical companies. She's not coming out because she's trying to make money out of all of this. She's simply coming out because as somebody who's actually close as possible to the development of this particular vaccine and seeing the result of her work, she's realized that she needs to do something. She needs to actually help people and she needs to save lives. So you've got to realize that this kind of whistleblower with this amount of credibility is putting her own credibility on the line. And this is the sort of person that we need to come out. So a true hero, you've got to say, can be found in Diane Harper, because not only is she putting herself on the line, but she's putting her family name on the line, and she's going to come under immense attack, and she probably needs support from all of us and probably doesn't need us to start attacking her and saying that she's a mad chemist, and if anybody else was to die from it or experience an adverse reaction, etc., we should certainly not hold her responsible, because she is taking responsibility, and that's what we need people to do. We need to show them love because she's actually bothered to show us love. And hopefully this will encourage people in all different aspects in different areas of the world, and as we're starting to see now with Edward Snowden, etc., etc., Bradley Manning and so forth, we're actually starting to see people come out and say, hey, let's make a better world. So without, putting on my rose glasses and smoking a pipe, I've got to say to you, I'm pretty proud of what you're doing. But now let's move into an area where I'm not so proud. Let's have a look at these Australian banks. Now, if you have a look very recently, the Australian banks, believe it or not, and I thought this only happened in the United States or only in the big banks like Barclays, etc. in Europe. The Australian banks, that is the ANZ and MAQ Bank, have a look at this article here. We've got Australian bankers, the ANZ Bank and of course Macquarie Bank have been rigging or attempting to rig, well, they've been caught, the interest rates in Singapore. Now we've all heard of the interest rates being rigged, the LIBOR rate over in Europe by Barclays, etc. Well, now we've got our own ANZ Bank and Macquarie Bank doing it in Singapore, and as a result, they've got to keep over $300 million in reserve. So, and the scary thing is, all they come out and say is, oh, it was inappropriate conduct. Now, that's what really scares me, because it's more than inappropriate conduct. When you start to rig interest rates, you've got to remember that these interest rates are what people actually lend money on. And it's not just you, it's not punters like you and me. We're talking about councils who it determines how much their budgets are, which determines how many firemen they've got to put out fires in their area, how many teachers they can get to determine the budgets, so that it determines the level of the education for their children, and then this trickles down and goes on for a very long period of time. And then for them to turn around and say, oh, well, what I just did on that day was just inappropriate, it has huge effects. And of course no one goes to jail, and in fact no one loses their job until yesterday, where in London we finally started to get some kickback, where George Osborne, have a look at this article with George Osborne, he started to suggest that maybe bankers should in fact go to jail. No way, have a look at this. It's an interesting one to see that it's just not all the Federal Reserve, and of course the Australian banks have been caught out as well. So we'll move on from there, and keeping on the Australian theme, I think, and also you might say the US theme as well, we heard recently about the hunger strikes that were going on at Gitmo. That's right, Guantanamo Bay, which is holding people without a charge for years and years, up to about 8 or 9 years. We have our own prisoner, Hicks, that has returned to Australia and written an extremely interesting book. I think if you have a look, for example, at Britain have been caught out pretty recently over in Afghanistan. It turns out in Iraq, etc., they've got their own Gitmo where they've been holding people for about 14 months. Well, I found out pretty recently, I was actually at a wedding, believe it or not, of all places, where I got tipped off by a worker at the Australian Embassy in Afghanistan who looked at me really blankly and just said, "What do you mean? Australia's got a Gitmo as well in Afghanistan. We've got a prison and we've just been caught with doing our own torture." And I looked at him and I thought, mate, have you had too much to drink? And then I went online and have a look at this article. And as you can see there, Australia's actually been caught out doing their own form of torturing, very similar to the British, and in fact, very similar to the United States. So it seems when everyone looks at each other and says, you know, Australia isn't guilty of all these sorts of horrible crimes, that the US and the rest of maybe NATO, even though we are part of the biggest team, it seems that Australia, in fact, has its own jails overseas, that it's doing horrible things to mankind, and it's guilty of these sorts of war crimes. So I think as Australian citizens, we've got to start asking the questions. We're spying on how are we different from the United States? We're spying on our own citizens. We're guilty, like the Federal Reserve is, of trying to rig different interest rates around the world. We're also guilty of now treating foreigners with torture, and we're opening prisons overseas. I mean, as an Australian citizen, I've got to say, I'm pretty disappointed. Even with our own politicians who are coming out and just lying to us and working for greater masters. As an Australian, I must say that I'm pretty disappointed all around. The only difference between us and maybe people in different countries is we seem pretty empathetic. We don't really riot. We don't really stand up. So that's what really does start to concern me. As Australians, we start to look at any foreigners coming to this country and we say, go back to your own country, as if you're not good enough. I think it's time as Australians that we really start to get our own country in order and start to define our own sovereignty before we start to lose it all. Anyway, that's just brazy. That's just my opinion, and I'm really interested to hear what your opinion is, because I'd like to have our culture defined and have it one that comes from our heart
and comes from our and puts our soul in order first, and stop being and letting it be controlled and, you know, and defined by higher masters, by some sort of cabal, some sort of new world order, which clearly it is, because we seem to just be following suit wherever it seems to be occurring in other countries around the world, and we seem to we've lost that very essence of what we used to be. This is Brazy.